Hi, everyone, and welcome to this session of the 2021 Coastal Research Symposium. My name is Scott Pippin. I'm a member of the public service faculty at the University of Georgia's Carl Vinson Institute of Government. I'm here to talk a little bit about an ongoing research project we have looking at there's policy and social barriers to the growth and development of oyster aquaculture in Georgia. Um, Everyone's probably aware that oysters are really important in Georgia. They are pretty just extremely common and almost ubiquitous on the Georgia coast. They grow on everything, they grow everywhere. They're important to the ecosystem and natural function of our marsh systems, and also very important to the coastal society and or the history of our coastal communities. In addition, oysters are very important to coastal resilience. They serve a number of functions, stabilizing shorelines, absorbing a lot of the wave energy, both from tidal events and storm surges, and do a lot to protect the structural integrity of our coastal marshes and other coastal areas. They also play an important role in filtering water, and they clean. An oyster is supposed to be able to clean about 50 gallons of water a day. And they also provide a lot of habitat and structure for other species to find protection from predators and also to spawn and lay their eggs. And they're just this integral part of many aspects of our coastal environment. And they're also increasingly used as part of our coastal built environment. There's a growing move to replace a lot of the sort of coastal armoring infrastructure, a lot of hard armoring bulkheads and seawalls with living shorelines, and using things like oyster shells and oyster reefs as part of an armoring structure that not only can provide the protections from erosion and from flooding that you would have with a seawall or a bulkhead, but also providing some of those environmental functions of providing habitat and water quality benefits, and also at the same time providing a level of adaptation, because a living shoreline is an adaptive measure that can shift and grow as sea level rise and as the coastal environment changes, whereas a bulkhead is a very relatively actually fragile structure that needs constant maintenance and needs to be updated and upgraded as conditions change or worsen. That's really what I'm here to talk about. What we're talking about is how oysters are growing as an economic commodity, about how they can be farmed and grown, and how that can in turn contribute to the resilience of our coastal communities. So everybody who's seen oysters growing wild knows that they in Georgia they typically grow in these big clumps because of their proliferation and the amount of oyster seed or oyster spat in the water. All the oysters just tend to grow on top of each other, and they grow in every little nook and cranny where they can find some purchase. And this is great in terms of total oyster production and the number of oysters that we grow. But those oysters are not the ones that are the currently most valued. They're great for oyster roasts, and they're great for the environment as a whole, but they don't, that type of oyster growth doesn't produce these beautiful, uniform, crafted half-shell oysters that are the kind of more or less dominate the market these days. I mean, these are the oysters that people are willing to pay multiple dollars an oyster for at a fancy restaurant, and the kinds that get written about in food magazines, and that take a beautiful picture. Those are not the kind of oysters that you typically see growing in Georgia now, and so a lot of this effort is focused around advancing efforts of Georgia Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant to work with Georgia DNR and coastal growers to develop practices to grow oysters that look more like this, and how we can take the value of the Georgia coast at producing oysters and produce this higher dollar, this higher value economically product that we can both consume domestically and export to other areas. Um, and also that type of product serves as an opportunity to really bolster tourism and environmental education on the coast. Like it's more than just producing a higher dollar commodity. It's also drawing attention to the oyster as an organism and its role in the environment and its role in cleaning water and its significance in coastal resilience and talking about those issues. So this is an educational and outreach opportunity in this in the promotion of Georgia oyster as well. We've seen over the last couple of decades a tremendous growth in shellfish production, both in Georgia and throughout the Southeast. In Georgia, Georgia's clam industry has, seen a tremendous amount of growth from being almost non-existent, in the mid 1990s to a significant part of our seafood industry. Whereas Virginia has sort of been the case study for what you can do with this half-shell oyster industry. Historically, Virginia produced lots and lots and lots of oysters, much like Georgia did, but through a change in demand and environmental degradation and decline in production, by the early 2000s, that had fallen to a minimal amount. But in recent years, due to the environmental restoration efforts and due to promotion of locally marketed oysters and the growth of demand for these half-shell oysters and in fine dining locations and their role in increased tourism and ecotourism and environmental education efforts, they've seen just a tremendous development in their oyster industry. And so it's really trying to capitalize on that trend and that development that we're engaged in this effort and really driving a lot of the other efforts that you might be aware of from Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant. Because in connecting it back to coastal resilience, it's important that economic development happen and that there are good jobs and solid industries to fund the adaptive measures that we need to see to build more resilient communities. But it's also important to think about what types of jobs those are and how those jobs themselves are contributing to the resilience of our communities. And the oyster industry is one that depends on having a robust and resilient environmental system. It's not just having a place to put some cages out in the water and grow these oysters. It depends on having a functional marsh system and clean estuaries and tidal creeks and managing stormwater well and doing all these things that create an environment where these creatures can grow and thrive and producing the type of product that we can really sell. And so I think having economic development that is based around industries that promote that type of environmental sustainability and promote resilience and that kind of thinking is important to thinking about resilience in its totality. So what this project entails is looking at how the growth of this industry might entail additional user conflicts, how it might run into problems with local regulations, and then trying to assess what are the various ways this can really stimulate the economy in these coastal environments, and then trying to figure out what the long-term impacts of that might be. And user conflicts really boils down to the fact that these, unlike some of the wild oyster harvests that take place in the space between low tide and high tide, where it's pretty well established that landowners have the right to harvest these oyster cages will be in the subtidal waters, which means that they'll be anchored to state property. And in those areas, there's something called the public trust doctrine that says those areas are maintained for public use and public benefit, which means that everybody has a right to use them. There are various expectations and rights that people have. And so how is using these areas for private economic production going to interfere with those? How are people going to feel about it if suddenly the areas that they boat in or fish in are less accessible or just somehow changed by the presence of these facilities? the protection of the viewshed, the protection of people's views from certain, well-known viewpoints, from bridges and whatnot, or from their coastal houses, or from coastal communities in general, are also a common complaint. It's in other states that we've looked at. That's probably the most common thing you see. It's likely to be less of a concern in Georgia, given the remoteness of some of the areas where these things would be located, but it's still a potential conflict as people become more aware and potentially aggrieved by these locations. But again, boating, fishing is probably the most likely conflict. But then, what other conflicts might we expect that we haven't thought of yet? So it's something we'll be looking at. And so we will do that by looking to other states and by identifying what sort of conflicts have arisen as this industry has grown. This is just a news article that was came out last spring based on some potential litigation around the expansion of oyster farms in Massachusetts. But again, it's based on homeowners and people in the neighborhood, in the surrounding neighborhoods, being concerned about the visual impacts of growing numbers of oyster cages in their view, and then sort of looking at how these things have been resolved, or what kind of problems they lead into in the development of the industry, and how might we be able to work with growers and work with regulators to avoid some of those problems. And then we'll look at how local regulations affect the development industry. Recently, Georgia, the state of Georgia has adopted new regulations to permit more different technologies, more modern technologies in the growing of these types of oysters. And so they've removed a lot of the state level barriers to this industry, which is one reason we foresee a lot of growth in the near future. But a lot remains to be seen about what local governments are going to do and how this is going to be viewed at the local level, particularly as those user conflicts, if user conflicts like viewsheds and voter conflicts become a greater issue, are the local governments going to become involved in is zoning of the processing facilities and other onshore aspects of this industry grow? Because it's really, while most of the activity in these oysters are actually growing out in the water, when they're brought to shore, there's a certain amount of processing that has to happen, which you can see there in that bottom picture, where you're cleaning the oysters and hosing them off and getting them ready for package and shipment. There's going to be industrial activities of having large coolers and having trucks to ship them and move them and get them where they need to be. But then there's also, again, that entertainment and restaurant and tourist aspect of it that may crop up in some of these areas. A lot of these places often have music venues and have on-site shucking places and have educational opportunities for people to come. And so how are these different types of operations going to fit with local government comprehensive plans and zoning regulations, and understanding those things and making sure that communities are ready to address those potential conflicts and those potential issues, and so that they don't become unnecessary stumbling blocks and barriers to the future of this industry. And then finally, we're going to look at what the variety of those economic opportunities are in Georgia. Like I say, we look around the country and see a lot of different sort of business models for how oyster aquaculture operations function, from just being direct wholesale operations where they put them on trucks and sell them to restaurants in the city, to on-site restaurants, to sort of tourist venues where people come and take tours of the operation and maybe have events, weddings, and other types of parties. What sort of things can we expect to see in the Georgia market in the near future? And so we'll do that by surveying oyster growers, restaurateurs, tourism officials, economic development professionals, to understand what their vision is for the future of the oyster industry in Georgia, and how that relates to the other aspects that we've talked about, the potential user conflicts and local land use provisions, and how we can sort of identify the opportunities and barriers that are likely to come up as this industry becomes a more significant part of our coastal economy. And this work is also just part of a larger effort that we're engaged in, where we are also studying user conflicts on a broader scale through a project funded by NOAA, and then translating all this research into a vision for the future of the Georgia oyster industry through a grant funded by the Jamestown Foundation, which we're actually working with a broad stakeholder group of oyster growers and oyster other professionals involved in the oyster industry to see how they can also work together and identify opportunities to support each other and support this industry more holistically, and really avoid some of the pitfalls and obstacles that that we can, all the ones that we can. So that's our work to date. It's something we're really excited about seeing where it goes, and I look forward to talking with you all about this project when I see you. So thank you.